The morning sun filtered through the towering oak trees of Blackwood University, casting long shadows across the pristine campus grounds. Students hurried between buildings, their backpacks heavy with textbooks and dreams of futures yet to be written. Among them walked a young woman whose presence seemed to blend seamlessly into the collegiate atmosphere, unremarkable in every conceivable way. Maya Chen appeared to be the epitome of an average graduate student. Her dark hair was perpetually pulled back in a simple ponytail, wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, and her clothes consisted of practical jeans and oversized sweaters that seemed to swallow her petite frame. She carried herself with the slightly hunched posture of someone who spent too many hours hunched over books, and her interactions with fellow students were polite but brief, marked by shy smiles and soft-spoken responses. What no one knew, what no one could have possibly suspected, was that Maya Chen was the most efficient killer the world had ever known. Her apartment near campus reflected the same deliberate ordinariness as her public persona. Textbooks on molecular biology and biochemistry lined her shelves, mixed with the occasional novel to maintain the illusion of a well-rounded student. A small desk by the window held a laptop where she supposedly worked on her thesis about enzyme structures and their applications in pharmaceutical development. The kitchen was sparse but functional, the refrigerator stocked with the kind of simple groceries a budget-conscious student would buy. But behind a false wall in her bedroom closet lay a different world entirely. Precision instruments gleamed in organized rows, knives forged from materials that didn't officially exist, syringes filled with toxins that could stop a heart in seconds, and communication devices that connected her to a network spanning continents. This was the real Maya Chen's workspace, where she planned and executed contracts that shaped the hidden currents of global power. The philosophy that had driven her to this point was simple yet profound. The weak version of herself had died long ago, destroyed by her own hand through years of brutal self-discipline and transformation. She had methodically eliminated every trace of vulnerability, every moment of hesitation, every flicker of mercy that might compromise her effectiveness. In doing so, she had become untouchable, invincible in a way that those who clung to their weaknesses could never understand. Maya's transformation had begun in childhood, though she rarely allowed herself to dwell on those memories. Born in a small village outside Shanghai, she had been the daughter of factory workers, quiet people who kept their heads down and asked for nothing more than to be left alone to live their simple lives. That peace had been shattered when local crime syndicates began extorting protection money from the village businesses. Her father had tried to organize resistance among the workers, believing that collective action could drive out the corruption. The mistake had cost him his life. Maya had been 12 when she found her father's body in the factory where he worked, his death staged to look like an industrial accident. The local police, already in the pocket of the criminals, had closed the case within hours. Her mother, devastated and terrorized, had taken Maya and fled to a distant relative in Hong Kong, where they lived in a cramped apartment and struggled to survive. It was there, in the urban jungle of Hong Kong's underworld, that Maya first encountered the type of person she would eventually become. A woman known only as Teacher had noticed the girl's intelligence and burning hatred, recognizing potential that others overlooked. Under Teacher's guidance, Maya learned that strength came not from righteous anger or the support of others, but from the complete mastery of oneself. The weak seek justice, Teacher had told her during those early lessons. The strong become justice. But first you must kill the weak child inside you. She will only hold you back. The training had been merciless. Physical conditioning that pushed her body beyond what seemed humanly possible. Mental exercises that taught her to compartmentalize emotion, to access fury and coldness with equal ease while maintaining perfect control over both. Languages, cultures, psychology, chemistry, anatomy. She absorbed knowledge like a sponge, each new skill becoming another weapon in her arsenal. But the most important lesson had been about weakness itself. Teacher showed her that most people failed not because they lacked skill or opportunity, but because they couldn't bring themselves to destroy the parts of their personality that limited them. They clung to old versions of themselves, to comfortable patterns of thought and behavior, even when those patterns led inevitably to defeat. A man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, Teacher had said, because he has already done the hardest work. He has become his own executioner and his own rebirth. By the time Maya arrived at Blackwood University at age 25, she had spent over a decade systematically dismantling every aspect of her original personality that could be considered a liability. The frightened child who had discovered her father's body was gone. The grieving daughter who had wept in her mother's arms was gone. The young woman who had initially trained with dreams of simple revenge was gone. What remained was something far more dangerous, a consciousness stripped of everything except purpose and capability. Her cover as a graduate student was more than just disguise. It was a masterpiece of long-term planning. The university provided access to advanced laboratories where she could synthesize compounds that didn't appear in any textbook. The international student population offered perfect camouflage for someone who needed to travel frequently without raising suspicions. And the academic environment, with its culture of intense focus and antisocial behavior, meant that her preference for solitude appeared completely normal. Professor James Whitmore, her thesis advisor, saw Maya exactly as she intended, a brilliant but unremarkable student whose research into enzyme inhibitors showed promise but nothing revolutionary. Their weekly meetings followed a careful script she had developed, with Maya presenting just enough progress to satisfy his expectations, while revealing nothing that might draw deeper scrutiny. "Your work on acetylcholinesterase inhibitors is quite sophisticated," Professor Whitmore had noted during their last meeting. "Have you considered the pharmaceutical applications?" "I'm primarily interested in the theoretical aspects," Maya had replied, offering the shy smile that had become second nature. "Though I suppose there could be medical benefits." What she didn't mention was that her research into enzyme inhibitors was actually focused on developing new methods of untraceable assassination. The compound she was perfecting could cause heart failure that would be indistinguishable from natural causes even under the most thorough autopsy. It was work that would have horrified Professor Whitmore, but to Maya it was simply another step in her ongoing evolution. Her fellow students saw her as the quiet girl who always sat in the back of lectures, taking meticulous notes but rarely participating in discussions. She had cultivated relationships with several classmates, casual friendships built on study sessions and coffee shop conversations that revealed nothing meaningful about her true nature. These connections served multiple purposes. They provided alibis when needed, sources of information about campus activities, and maintained the illusion that she was just another struggling graduate student trying to balance research with a social life. Sarah Martinez, a bubbly psychology doctoral candidate, had become Maya's most consistent acquaintance through their shared love of the campus coffee shop. "You're so mysterious, Maya," Sarah would tease. "I feel like I know nothing about you except that you're super smart and drink way too much caffeine." "Not much to know," Maya would reply with practiced self-deprecation. "Just trying to finish my degree without going completely insane." Maya had to monitor every word, every expression, every gesture to ensure she revealed nothing that might contradict her cover story. She had created entire false memories about her childhood, her family, her motivations for studying biochemistry. The lies came as naturally as breathing now, but they required the same methodical precision that characterized everything else in her life. The real challenge wasn't maintaining her cover, it was suppressing the predator that lurked beneath the surface during these mundane social interactions. When Sarah laughed at something she found funny, Maya had to consciously remind herself to smile rather than analyze the vulnerabilities revealed by the girl's body language. When Professor Whitmore grew frustrated with bureaucratic delays in their research funding, Maya had to resist the urge to offer solutions that would involve permanently removing the bureaucrats in question. This constant self-monitoring was exhausting in a way that physical training or actual assassination contracts never were. At least when she was working, she could be herself, or rather, the self she had chosen to become. The pretense of normalcy required her to constantly hold back, to be less than she was, and that restraint created a tension that could only be released through action. Her contracts came through encrypted communications that appeared to be routine academic correspondence. A message about a conference in Geneva might actually contain instructions for eliminating a rogue intelligence operative. A request for collaboration from a university in Tokyo could be a detailed briefing on infiltrating a corporate executive's security detail. Maya had developed her own coded language that allowed her to conduct business while leaving a paper trail that would support her academic cover under any investigation. The fees for her services had allowed her to live comfortably while maintaining the appearance of a struggling student. She drove a used Honda Civic that looked appropriately modest for someone on a graduate stipend, but it had been extensively modified with hidden compartments and enhanced performance capabilities. Her apartment's rent was officially paid through a research assistantship, while the money for her true expenses came from numbered accounts in countries that didn't ask questions about the source of deposits. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Maya's double life was how completely she had convinced herself that this was the natural order of things. She felt no guilt about the lives she took, no conflict about the deception she practiced daily. The weak version of herself who might have struggled with such contradictions was dead, killed as surely as any of her targets. What remained was a being of perfect focus and ruthless efficiency. She had become, in her own mind, something beyond human categories of morality. She wasn't evil. Evil implied a choice to do wrong despite knowing better. She was simply a force of nature, like a hurricane or an earthquake, that reshaped the world according to laws that ordinary people couldn't comprehend. The people she killed had made themselves targets through their own choices and weaknesses. The students and professors she deceived had chosen to see only what they wanted to see, accepting her facade because it was convenient and non-threatening. In destroying her weak self, Maya had gained something that she considered infinitely more valuable than humanity. She had gained absolute freedom from the limitations that constrained others. She could be anyone, do anything, go anywhere, because she was no longer bound by the emotional attachments and moral constraints that kept most people trapped in predictable patterns. This philosophy would soon be tested in ways she couldn't anticipate. Blackwood University was about to become the stage for events that would challenge even Maya's supreme confidence in her own evolution. Hidden among the faculty and students were individuals whose own transformations had taken them down different but equally radical paths. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the university's new chancellor, had arrived 6 months earlier with credentials that impressed even the most skeptical faculty members. Her background in international education and crisis management seemed perfectly suited to the challenges facing modern higher education. What the search committee hadn't known was that Dr. Vasquez had spent 15 years developing psychological warfare techniques for intelligence agencies, specializing in the art of identifying and neutralizing individuals who believed themselves to be beyond conventional influence. Professor David Chen, no relation to Maya despite the shared surname, taught philosophy courses that consistently drew overflow crowds despite their reputation for intellectual rigor. His lectures on the nature of personal transformation and the destruction of limiting beliefs had attracted a devoted following among students seeking meaning in an increasingly chaotic world. But Professor Chen's interest in transformation extended far beyond academic theory. He had spent years studying individuals who had undergone radical personality changes, and he had begun to suspect that at least one of his university students represented a case study more extreme than anything in the literature. And then there was Marcus Webb, a senior undergraduate whose academic performance was unremarkable but whose extracurricular activities had begun to attract attention from certain government agencies. Marcus had been investigating what he believed was a pattern of unusual deaths among prominent business and political figures, deaths that seemed to cluster around major universities where international conferences were held. His research had led him to develop theories about the existence of professional assassins operating under academic cover. None of these individuals suspected Maya's true nature, but their presence at Blackwood University was not coincidental. Forces beyond the campus were beginning to converge, drawn by intelligence reports, academic research, and personal obsessions that would soon shatter the careful equilibrium Maya had constructed around her double life. The first indication that something was changing came during a routine surveillance check Maya performed every few weeks. Using skills learned from years of counterintelligence training, she had developed methods for determining whether she was being watched or investigated. These checks involved subtle changes to her routine, careful observation of her surroundings, and monitoring of her electronic communications for any signs of interference. On a Tuesday evening in late October, Maya detected what appeared to be sophisticated surveillance of her apartment building. The signs were almost invisible: vehicles parked in positions that provided sightlines to her windows, pedestrians whose walking patterns seemed just slightly too convenient, electronic signatures that suggested monitoring equipment in the area. A less experienced operative might have dismissed these observations as paranoia, but Maya's training had taught her that paranoia was just another word for awareness. Rather than panic or immediately flee, Maya's first instinct was to gather intelligence about whoever was watching her. This required her to maintain her normal routine while conducting a careful investigation, a balancing act that would test every skill she had developed over the years. If her watchers were government agents, they would be looking for any deviation from her established patterns. If they were competitors or enemies from her professional life, they would be waiting for her to reveal herself through defensive measures. The next morning, Maya attended her usual biochemistry seminar, took notes on enzyme kinetics, and participated in a group discussion about research methodologies. Every gesture was calculated to reinforce her identity as a dedicated but unremarkable graduate student. But beneath the surface, her mind was racing through possibilities and contingencies, preparing for scenarios that could range from simple investigation to immediate lethal threat. She was about to discover that her philosophy about destroying weakness to become invulnerable was about to face its ultimate test. The forces gathering around Blackwood University represented forms of strength she hadn't encountered before, not the crude power of criminals or the bureaucratic authority of governments, but the subtle influence of individuals who had undergone their own transformations in pursuit of purposes that remained hidden. The game was beginning, though Maya didn't yet realize that she was no longer the only player who had learned the rules by destroying their weaker self. The campus that had provided her with perfect cover was about to become a battleground where multiple forms of evolved consciousness would clash in ways that would determine not just who survived, but what survival itself meant in a world where ordinary human limitations no longer applied. Part 2. The art of recognition. Maya's investigation into her potential surveillance began with the methodical precision that characterized all her operations. She spent the following days mapping the patterns of activity around her apartment building, identifying every individual who appeared more than once in her vicinity and analyzing the subtle signs that distinguished genuine coincidence from professional observation. The surveillance team, if it existed, was remarkably sophisticated. They rotated personnel frequently enough to avoid easy identification, used vehicles that belonged to legitimate businesses in the area, and maintained electronic discipline that suggested military or intelligence training. But Maya's own skills were the product of training that exceeded most government programs, and gradually she began to identify the structure of the operation watching her. 3-person teams working 8-hour shifts, communication equipment that created barely detectable electromagnetic signatures, movement patterns designed to appear random, while maintaining continuous coverage of her building's entrances. Most tellingly, the operation showed patience. They were content to watch and gather information rather than moving to immediate action, which suggested they weren't certain about her identity or capabilities. This patience gave Maya time to prepare, but it also created a puzzle that challenged her analytical skills. Who would have the resources and motivation to mount such a sophisticated operation against a graduate student in biochemistry? The most obvious possibility was that her professional identity had been compromised, but she could think of no recent contracts that would have left evidence pointing to her. Another possibility was that this was related to some other activity on campus. Perhaps she had simply been unlucky enough to live in a building under surveillance for reasons unconnected to her true nature. The answer began to emerge during her weekly meeting with Professor Whitmore, though not in any way she could have anticipated. The professor seemed unusually distracted, frequently checking his phone and glancing toward the window of his office with an expression Maya had learned to recognize as suppressed anxiety. "Is everything all right, Professor?" Maya asked, maintaining the tone of concerned student that had become second nature. "Oh, it's probably nothing," Whitmore replied, but his body language suggested otherwise. "We've had some unusual inquiries about our research programs lately. Government agencies asking about student projects, that sort of thing. The administration is being very quiet about it, but some of us are wondering if there's been some kind of security concern." Maya felt a chill of recognition. The surveillance wasn't targeting her specifically. It was part of a broader investigation into the university's research programs. This was both better and worse than her initial assumptions. Better because it meant her cover hadn't been blown by evidence from her professional activities. Worse because it suggested a systematic investigation that might uncover her true nature through sheer thoroughness rather than specific intelligence. "What kind of government agencies?" Maya asked, careful to sound curious rather than alarmed. "That's just it. Nobody seems to know for certain. The inquiries have come through official channels, but they're vague about which department or agency is actually interested. Could be Homeland Security, could be the FBI, could be something more specialized. The Chancellor has been meeting with various officials, but she's not sharing details with the faculty." Maya filed this information while maintaining the conversation for an appropriate length of time before excusing herself to work on her research. But instead of returning to her apartment or the laboratory, she made a decision that would have significant consequences. She decided to investigate Dr. Akram, Elena Vasquez, directly. The Chancellor's office was located in the administration building, a neo-Gothic structure that dominated the central quad of the campus. Maya had never had any direct interaction with Dr. Vasquez, but she had observed her from a distance during various university events. The woman projected an aura of competent authority that impressed faculty and students alike, But Maya's trained eye had noticed details that suggested a background more complex than academic administration. Dr. Vasquez moved with the controlled grace of someone who had undergone extensive physical training. Her awareness of her surroundings was consistently high even during routine campus interactions. Most tellingly, she had the habit of positioning herself in rooms to maintain sightlines to exits and to avoid having her back to open spaces, behavior that was automatic in people with military or intelligence experience. Conducting surveillance on the Chancellor would require Maya to take risks she had never faced as a student. Security around the administration building was tighter than in other areas of campus, and Dr. Vasquez likely had access to resources that could quickly identify and investigate anyone showing unusual interest in her activities. But Maya's curiosity about the investigation affecting the university had become more than professional interest. It was beginning to feel personal. The opportunity came during the university's annual International Education Conference, a 3-day event that brought academics and officials from around the world to discuss global cooperation in higher education. Maya registered to attend several sessions that would allow her to observe Dr. Vasquez in action while maintaining her cover as a graduate student interested in international academic opportunities. The conference was held in the university's largest auditorium, a modern facility designed to accommodate hundreds of attendees while providing state-of-the-art audiovisual capabilities. Maya arrived early for the opening session, choosing a seat that provided good sightlines to the stage, while keeping her in the midst of other students and junior faculty members. Dr. Vasquez's opening remarks were polished and professional, covering themes of international cooperation, cultural exchange, and the role of universities in fostering global understanding. But Maya's attention was focused not on the content of the speech but on the Chancellor's behavior and the reactions of specific individuals in the audience. 2 men in the front row were taking notes with an intensity that seemed excessive for an academic presentation. Their clothing, posture, and attention patterns suggested law enforcement or intelligence backgrounds. More importantly, they occasionally glanced at specific individuals in the audience, including Maya herself, with the systematic coverage of people working from a list of subjects. Maya felt the familiar sensation of being a predator who had suddenly realized she might also be prey. Her training had prepared her for situations where she was the subject of investigation, but those scenarios had assumed she would be operating in hostile foreign environments where such attention was expected. Being under scrutiny while maintaining her civilian cover created complications she had never fully considered. The session took an unexpected turn during the question and answer period following Dr. Vasquez's presentation. A man Maya didn't recognize stood up in the middle section of the auditorium and asked a question that seemed innocuous but carried undertones that made her pay closer attention. Dr. Vasquez, given the increasing concerns about international security, what protocols does the university have for monitoring research that might have dual-use applications, particularly research conducted by international students or faculty with connections to foreign institutions? The question was phrased academically, but Maya recognized the technique of using public forums to send messages to specific audiences. Someone was letting Dr. Vasquez know that they were aware of security concerns related to the university's international population, and they wanted to gauge her response. Dr. Vasquez's answer was equally layered. The university maintains strict protocols for research oversight, working closely with appropriate federal agencies to ensure that our academic mission doesn't conflict with national security interests. We found that transparency and cooperation are the best approaches to addressing any concerns that might arise. Vasquez had acknowledged the existence of federal cooperation, without specifying which agencies were involved or what form that cooperation took. It was a politician's answer, but delivered with the confidence of someone who had substantial resources backing her position. After the session, Maya followed a carefully planned route that would allow her to observe the behavior of the officials she had spotted without appearing to show interest in them specifically. This required her to move through the crowd with apparent randomness while actually executing a complex surveillance pattern that kept multiple targets in view. What she observed confirmed her growing suspicion that the university was the focus of a major investigation. The officials were conducting their own surveillance of conference attendees, paying particular attention to international students and faculty members. They had electronic devices that were almost certainly being used for communication and possibly for electronic monitoring of conversations in their vicinity. Most disturbing was the realization that Maya herself was among their subjects of interest. She noticed one of the officials directing his partner's attention toward her during a moment when she thought she was unobserved. They weren't focusing on her exclusively, but she was clearly on a list of individuals worthy of attention. This discovery forced Maya to reconsider her entire situation at Blackwood University. If she was under systematic investigation, her carefully constructed cover might be in jeopardy regardless of how well she had executed her deception. Government investigators had resources and legal authorities that could eventually penetrate even the most sophisticated false identities, particularly if they had specific reasons to focus their attention. The logical response would be to activate her emergency protocols and disappear from the university before the investigation could progress further. She had planned for such contingencies, maintaining escape routes and backup identities that would allow her to vanish within hours of recognizing a serious threat to her cover. But something kept her from initiating those procedures immediately. Partly it was professional pride. Maya had spent years perfecting her academic persona, and abandoning it without understanding the exact nature of the threat felt like a defeat. But more significantly, she had begun to recognize that the situation at Blackwood University was more complex than a simple investigation into her activities. Multiple parties with their own agendas were operating on campus, and the investigation she had detected might be as much about understanding those other parties as it was about her. This realization came into sharper focus during her encounter with Professor David Chen, following the conference session. Maya had been walking across campus when she noticed Professor Chen sitting on a bench near the library, reading what appeared to be student papers but occasionally glancing up to observe the people passing by. On an impulse that surprised her, Maya rarely acted without careful consideration. She approached the philosophy professor and asked if she could join him on the bench. Professor Chen looked up from his papers with an expression that seemed both welcoming and evaluative. Of course. Maya Chen, isn't it? Biochemistry graduate student? His voice carried a slight accent that Maya couldn't immediately identify, and his knowledge of her name suggested either an excellent memory or specific interest in her as an individual. That's right. I don't think we've been formally introduced, but I've heard excellent things about your courses on personal transformation. Professor Chen smiled, but his eyes maintained an intensity that made Maya feel as though she were being analyzed rather than conversed with. Transformation is a fascinating subject. Most people believe they can change without really understanding what change requires. They want to become different while remaining essentially the same. Maya found herself genuinely intrigued by this opening. What do you think real change requires? Death, Professor Chen replied without hesitation. Not physical death, but the death of the self that exists before transformation. Most people can't bring themselves to kill who they used to be, so they never become who they could be. The words resonated with Maya's own philosophy in a way that was both thrilling and alarming. Here was someone who understood the principles that had guided her own evolution, but she couldn't determine whether his interest in transformation was theoretical or personal. That sounds like a rather extreme view for a philosophy professor, Maya said, testing his response. Is it extreme, or is it simply honest about what transformation actually involves? Consider the butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. The caterpillar doesn't gradually become a butterfly. It dissolves completely and is rebuilt as something entirely different. The caterpillar must die for the butterfly to live. Maya felt a chill of recognition. This man was speaking her language, using metaphors that captured exactly how she thought about her own development. But she couldn't determine whether this was coincidence, whether Professor Chen had somehow identified her true nature, or whether he was conducting some kind of test or investigation. Have you undergone such a transformation yourself, Professor? She asked, deciding to probe more directly. Professor Chen was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested personal experience rather than academic theory. I've watched many people attempt transformation, and I've seen what happens to those who succeed. The ones who truly change become something that others can't easily categorize or understand. They operate according to principles that seem alien to those who remain trapped in their original patterns. That sounds lonely, Maya observed. Loneliness assumes a desire for connection with those who can't understand you. But why would someone who has transcended their limitations want to connect with those who remain limited? It would be like asking an adult to seek meaningful friendship with children. Maya felt a complex mixture of recognition and unease. Professor Chen was articulating thoughts she had never fully expressed to herself about her relationship with ordinary people. But his understanding was too precise, his metaphors too specific to her own experience. Either he had undergone a similar transformation, or he possessed insights into transformed individuals that suggested specialized knowledge. "You seem to have given this subject considerable thought," she said. "It's been a particular interest of mine for many years. I find that universities are excellent places to study transformation, particularly graduate programs that attract highly motivated individuals from diverse backgrounds." Maya's alertness spiked. Professor Chen's comment could be innocent academic observation, or it could be a subtle indication that he had been studying her specifically. The timing of their conversation, immediately following her discovery of the investigation into university research programs, seemed too coincidental to dismiss. "I should probably get back to my own research," Maya said, beginning to stand. "Of course." "But Maya..." Professor Chen's use of her first name was casual, but his tone had shifted to something more serious. "If you ever want to discuss the philosophy of transformation in more depth, I'd be happy to continue the conversation. I have a feeling you might have more interesting perspectives on the subject than most students." Maya nodded politely and walked away, but her mind was racing. Professor Chen's final comment had sounded like an invitation, but an invitation to what? If he suspected her true nature, approaching him could be walking into a trap. But if he was himself someone who had undergone radical transformation, he might be a valuable ally in understanding the complex situation developing around the university. The encounter with Professor Chen added another layer of complexity to Maya's analysis of her situation. She was now aware of at least 3 distinct elements operating on campus: the federal investigation that was monitoring international students and research programs, Dr. Vasquez's administrative response to that investigation, and Professor Chen's apparent interest in individuals who had undergone radical personal transformation. Maya's training had prepared her to handle threats that could be clearly identified and categorized, but the situation at Blackwood University was evolving into something more like a multidimensional chess game, where she couldn't see all the pieces or fully understand the rules. Each new piece of information created more questions while failing to provide clear guidance about appropriate action. That evening, Maya sat in her apartment conducting what she thought of as a strategic assessment. On one level, her situation remained relatively secure. Her cover identity showed no signs of direct compromise, her academic performance continued to satisfy expectations, and her professional activities had left no trails leading back to the university. But on another level, she was operating in an environment where multiple sophisticated parties were pursuing agendas she didn't fully understand. The prudent course would still be to activate her escape protocols and disappear before any of these various investigations could focus on her specifically. But Maya found herself reluctant to abandon the game before understanding what was really at stake. Her confidence in her own abilities had been built on successfully navigating complex and dangerous situations, and running from a threat she hadn't fully identified felt too much like the behavior of the weak person she had worked so hard to destroy. More importantly, she was beginning to suspect that the situation at Blackwood University might represent an opportunity rather than simply a threat, if other individuals operating on campus had undergone their own forms of transformation. If the university was somehow attracting people who had transcended normal human limitations, then this place might be exactly where she belonged. Maya had spent years operating in isolation, accepting loneliness as the inevitable price of her evolution. But Professor Chen's comments had made her consider possibilities she had never seriously contemplated. What if there were others like her? What if the path she had chosen wasn't as solitary as she had assumed? These thoughts represented dangerous territory. Maya's strength had always come from her independence, her refusal to depend on or trust anyone else. The desire for connection with others was exactly the kind of weakness she had systematically eliminated from her personality. But the possibility of connecting with individuals who had achieved similar levels of transformation was different from seeking approval or comfort from ordinary people. As Maya continued her analysis, she made a decision that would prove to be one of the most significant of her life. Instead of fleeing from the complex situation developing around her, she would engage more deeply with it. She would investigate Dr. Vasquez, Professor Chen, and whoever was conducting the federal investigation until she understood their capabilities, motivations, and potential utility to her own objectives. This decision represented a calculated risk that tested her core philosophy. By choosing to remain and engage rather than disappearing into safety, Maya was betting that her transformation had been complete enough to handle whatever challenges these other evolved individuals might present. She was choosing to test whether destroying her weak self had truly made her invulnerable to destruction by others. The game was about to begin in earnest, Though Maya still believed she would be setting the rules rather than discovering that the rules had already been established by players whose own transformations had taken them in directions she couldn't yet imagine. Part 3. The evolution of power. Maya's decision to remain at Blackwood University and investigate the various parties operating around her marked the beginning of the most complex operation of her career. Unlike her previous professional work, which had involved clearly defined objectives and identifiable opponents, this situation required her to gather intelligence while maintaining her cover identity and avoiding detection by multiple sophisticated adversaries simultaneously. Her first priority was understanding the federal investigation that Professor Whitmore had mentioned. Maya began by analyzing patterns in campus security, looking for changes that might indicate increased government presence or enhanced surveillance capabilities. She also monitored university communications, using skills acquired during her training to detect signs of cooperation between campus administration and external agencies. What she discovered was both more and less concerning than her initial assumptions. The investigation appeared to be comprehensive, but not focused specifically on her activities or identity. Instead, it seemed designed to identify individuals at the university who might pose security risks based on their research activities, international connections, or behavioral patterns that suggested concealment of important information. Maya realized that she qualified for attention under all three criteria. Her research into enzyme inhibitors had potential weapons applications, her fabricated background included international elements, and her carefully controlled behavior was exactly the kind of pattern that sophisticated surveillance would flag as suspicious. She was, in essence, a perfect target for an investigation designed to identify people exactly like her. This realization forced Maya to reconsider her fundamental approach to the situation. Simply avoiding detection was no longer sufficient. The investigation was thorough enough that it would eventually focus on her regardless of how well she maintained her cover. Her only viable options were to neutralize the investigation itself or to find ways to redirect its focus toward other targets. Both alternatives required Maya to abandon the passive intelligence gathering she had been conducting and move to active operations that would put her in direct conflict with federal agents. This prospect didn't frighten her. She had operated against government personnel in other contexts and understood their capabilities and limitations, but it would require her to reveal aspects of her true nature that she had kept hidden during her time at the university. The decision was made for her during what should have been a routine laboratory session. Maya was working alone in the biochemistry building, supposedly synthesizing compounds for her thesis research, but actually perfecting a new toxin that would be undetectable in standard autopsies, when she noticed that her electronic surveillance countermeasures had detected monitoring equipment in the adjacent room. Someone was conducting technical surveillance of her laboratory work, using equipment sophisticated enough to monitor her activities through laboratory walls. This was far beyond the casual observation she had detected around her apartment building. It represented a serious operational focus that suggested the investigation had moved beyond general information gathering to specific targeting. Maya's response was immediate and decisive. She continued her work while mentally cataloging the positioning and capabilities of the surveillance equipment, then began to plan a counter-operation that would allow her to identify and neutralize whoever was watching her. This would require her to demonstrate capabilities that no graduate student should possess, but the alternative was allowing the investigation to proceed until her identity was completely compromised. That night, Maya activated equipment from her hidden arsenal that she had never expected to use while maintaining her university cover. Electronic warfare devices that could identify and disrupt surveillance equipment, weapons and tools that would allow her to operate against trained professionals, communication gear that would connect her to resources outside the university if the situation escalated beyond what she could handle alone. But as Maya prepared for what she expected would be a straightforward neutralization of the federal surveillance operation, she discovered that the situation at Blackwood University was far more complex than she had understood. The technical surveillance of her laboratory wasn't being conducted by government agents. It was coming from a facility in the university's computer science building, operated by individuals whose equipment and techniques suggested capabilities equal to her own. This discovery changed everything. Maya had been preparing to deal with federal investigators who, regardless of their training and resources, were still operating within legal and bureaucratic constraints that limited their methods and responses. But the surveillance she had detected was being conducted by individuals who were operating outside those constraints. using techniques and equipment that suggested they were playing by rules similar to her own. Maya's investigation into the computer science facility required her to demonstrate infiltration skills she had hoped to keep hidden throughout her time at the university. Moving through the building at night, bypassing security systems that were more sophisticated than anything she had expected to find on a university campus, Maya discovered that the facility was far more than an academic research center. The equipment was military-grade. The security protocols were designed to prevent access by individuals with professional intelligence training, and the personnel records she accessed suggested that several of the facility's staff members had backgrounds in intelligence agencies and special operations units. Most significantly, the research being conducted involved analysis of behavioral patterns and communication intercepts that could only have been gathered through systematic surveillance of university faculty, students, and staff. Maya realized that she had stumbled into what appeared to be a covert intelligence operation using the university as cover for activities that had nothing to do with academic research. This facility wasn't part of the federal investigation she had detected. It was conducting its own separate operation, with objectives she couldn't immediately determine. The discovery was both alarming and exhilarating. Maya had spent years operating in isolation, believing that her transformation had made her unique in her capabilities and methods. But the computer science facility suggested that she wasn't alone. There were others operating at her level of sophistication, using similar techniques for purposes that remained hidden. Maya's reconnaissance of the facility was interrupted when she realized that her own infiltration was being monitored by security systems she hadn't detected. Instead of triggering an alarm that would bring campus security or law enforcement, the system seemed designed to track and analyze intrusion attempts while allowing them to continue. Someone wanted to observe what she would do and how she would do it. This realization transformed Maya's infiltration from an intelligence-gathering operation into a form of communication. Whoever controlled the facility's security was using her intrusion attempt to assess her capabilities, which meant they already suspected she was more than she appeared to be. Rather than withdraw immediately, Maya decided to demonstrate exactly how sophisticated her capabilities were. What followed was a complex dance of electronic warfare and physical infiltration that lasted several hours. Maya systematically defeated each layer of the facility's security, while the defenders adapted their countermeasures to test different aspects of her skills. It became clear that this was as much evaluation as it was conflict. Both parties were learning about each other through the process of attack and defense. The confrontation ended when Maya reached the facility's central control room and found a single person waiting for her. Marcus Webb, the undergraduate student whose academic record was unremarkable but whose extracurricular activities had attracted government attention. Marcus was sitting at a workstation that displayed real-time information about Maya's infiltration route, her methods for defeating the security systems, and analysis of her capabilities based on her performance. He looked up from the screens with an expression that combined respect, curiosity, and something that might have been relief. "Maya Chan," he said, using her name with the casual familiarity of someone who knew far more about her than she had realized. Graduate student in biochemistry, specializing in enzyme inhibitors with potential applications in developing untraceable toxins, also known in certain circles as someone who solves problems that can't be addressed through conventional means. Maya's first instinct was to eliminate Marcus immediately. He clearly knew enough about her true identity to compromise her cover completely, and his tone suggested confidence that indicated either substantial backup or capabilities she hadn't detected. But something in his manner suggested that killing him might be exactly the wrong response to this situation. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Maya replied, maintaining her student persona, while positioning herself to attack if necessary. "I don't think so. The federal investigation that's been worrying you is actually the least of your concerns. The real question is whether you're here at the university by coincidence or whether something drew you here just like it drew me." Marcus gestured toward the displays around the control room, which Maya could now see contained information about dozens of university personnel. Faculty members, students, and staff were represented by detailed profiles that included analysis of their backgrounds, behavior patterns, and potential hidden capabilities. "What is this place?" Maya asked, abandoning her pretense since Marcus clearly knew it was useless. "It's a research facility, but not the kind the university administration knows about. We're studying evolution, specifically the evolution of human consciousness and capabilities beyond normal limitations." Maya felt a chill of recognition. "We? People who've discovered that the traditional boundaries of human potential aren't as fixed as most people believe. People who've undergone transformations that make them fundamentally different from ordinary humans. People like you. Marcus stood up from his workstation and moved to another display that showed a map of the university campus with various locations highlighted in different colors. Professor Chen has been studying the philosophy of personal transformation for years, but recently he's become convinced that theoretical understanding isn't enough. Dr. Vasquez came here because her intelligence contacts identified the university as a gathering point for individuals with unusual capabilities. And you're here because your instincts led you to a place where you could operate without drawing the kind of attention that would compromise your other activities. Maya's mind was racing to process the implications of what Marcus was telling her. You're saying the university is some kind of magnet for people like us? Not exactly, but certain environments do seem to attract individuals who've transcended normal human limitations. Universities provide cover, resources, and intellectual stimulation that appeal to people whose capabilities extend beyond conventional categories. Maya moved closer to the displays, studying the profiles Marcus had compiled. She recognized several faculty members and students, but the analysis presented information about their backgrounds and capabilities that she had never suspected. How long have you been watching me? Since you arrived at the university. Your cover identity was excellent, but certain patterns in your behavior suggested capabilities that didn't match your supposed background. The federal investigation that detected you was actually initiated by intelligence we provided them. Maya felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. She had eliminated emotional responses like anger years ago, but learning that her careful operational security had been compromised by someone she had dismissed as an ordinary student challenged her fundamental confidence in her own abilities. Why? She asked. Because we needed to understand what kind of person you really are. The federal investigation was a test, not to expose you, but to see how you would respond to pressure. Would you panic and flee? Would you eliminate the investigators? Would you try to manipulate the situation to your advantage? Maya realized that she was looking at someone whose transformation had been as radical as her own, but had taken a completely different direction. Where she had become a predator focused on individual excellence and operational supremacy, Marcus seemed to have become something like a researcher studying the phenomena of human evolution itself. What do you want from me? Maya asked. The same thing we want from Dr. Vasquez and Professor Chen and the others we've identified. We want to understand what happens when human consciousness evolves beyond normal boundaries. We want to study the different paths that transformation can take, and ultimately, we want to determine whether people like us represent the future of human development. Maya studied Marcus's expression, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. What she saw was intellectual excitement combined with something that looked like loneliness, the isolation of someone who had evolved beyond normal human connections, but retained a desire to understand and connect with others who had undergone similar changes. You're proposing some kind of alliance, Maya said. I'm proposing that we stop pretending we're ordinary people playing ordinary roles. Each of us has developed capabilities that extend far beyond normal human limitations. But we're all operating in isolation because we believe that our transformations are unique. What if they're not? What if there's a pattern to human evolution that we can understand and perhaps direct? Maya found herself intrigued by possibilities she had never seriously considered. Her entire adult life had been built around the assumption that her transformation was a singular achievement that necessarily separated her from others. But if Marcus was right, if there were multiple individuals who had achieved similar levels of evolution through different paths, then perhaps isolation wasn't the inevitable price of transcendence. What about the federal investigation? Maya asked. That's being handled. Dr. Vasquez has resources that can redirect their attention toward other targets, and Professor Chen has been developing psychological techniques that can influence their perception of the information they've gathered. Maya realized that she was being invited to join something unprecedented in her experience, a group of individuals who had each transcended normal human limitations but were choosing to cooperate rather than compete. The concept challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of evolutionary advantage and the relationship between individual excellence and collective capability. This is a lot to process, Maya said. Take the time you need. But Maya? Marcus's tone became more serious. The world is changing in ways that most people don't recognize. The capabilities that people like us have developed aren't going to remain hidden forever. Eventually, society is going to have to acknowledge that human potential extends far beyond what they currently understand. When that happens, We can either be isolated individuals trying to navigate those changes alone, or we can be a community that's prepared to help guide human development in productive directions. Maya left the computer science facility with more questions than answers, but also with possibilities she had never imagined. The philosophy that had guided her transformation, that destroying her weak self would make her invulnerable to others, was being challenged by the prospect that cooperation with other evolved individuals might actually represent a higher form of strength. Over the following days, Maya found herself observing her fellow students and faculty members with new awareness. Marcus had provided her with access to the profiles compiled by his research facility, and she began to see patterns in behavior and capability that she had previously overlooked. The university wasn't just providing cover for people like her. It was somehow attracting them, creating an environment where individuals who had undergone radical personal transformation could operate while studying and learning from each other. Her interaction with Professor Chen took on new dimensions when she attended one of his lectures on the philosophy of personal transformation. His words, which she had previously heard as theoretical discussion, now sounded like practical guidance for individuals who had undergone the kind of changes she had experienced. The ultimate question, Professor Chen told his class, isn't whether human consciousness can evolve beyond current limitations. We know it can, because some individuals have already achieved such evolution. The question is whether that evolution represents isolated cases of individual excellence or whether it's part of a broader pattern that could eventually affect human society as a whole. Maya caught Professor Chen's eye during this statement and saw recognition there that confirmed Marcus's claims about the professor's knowledge of her true nature. But rather than feeling exposed or threatened, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Curiosity about possibilities that extended beyond her individual objectives. Vasquez was arranged through channels that demonstrated the Chancellor's sophisticated intelligence capabilities. Maya received a message that appeared to be routine university communication but contained coded language that directed her to a private meeting in Dr. Vasquez's office after normal business hours. Dr. Vasquez was direct in a way that Maya appreciated. Marcus tells me you've been briefed on our research project. I want to make sure you understand the larger context before you decide whether to participate. What larger context? The government investigation into university research programs isn't random. It's part of a broader effort to identify and monitor individuals whose capabilities suggest potential security concerns. Military and intelligence agencies are beginning to recognize that human potential extends beyond what their training programs have traditionally assumed. Dr. Vasquez activated a display that showed global maps with various locations highlighted. We've identified similar gathering points at universities around the world, places where individuals with unusual capabilities seem to gravitate, often without consciously understanding why they're drawn to those environments. Maya studied the display, recognizing several locations where she had operated during her professional career. You're suggesting this is a global phenomenon? We're suggesting that human evolution is continuing, and that some individuals are developing capabilities that represent the next stage in that evolution. The question is whether those individuals will develop in isolation, potentially becoming threats to existing social structures, or whether they can be integrated into communities that help them develop their capabilities constructively. Maya realized that Dr. Vasquez was describing a vision that went far beyond anything she had previously considered. Rather than operating as isolated individuals who had transcended human limitations, evolved humans could potentially form communities that guided broader human development. What role would I play in something like that? Maya asked. That depends on your own objectives. You've developed extraordinary capabilities in areas that most people would consider morally questionable. But moral judgments assume the perspective of individuals who haven't undergone the kind of transformation you've experienced. We're more interested in capability than conventional morality. Maya felt a complex mixture of liberation and uncertainty. Vasquez was suggesting that her professional activities as an assassin weren't necessarily disqualifying factors in whatever this group was proposing, but accepting such a perspective would require her to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the relationship between individual excellence and social responsibility. The conversation with Dr. Vasquez continued for several hours, covering topics that range from practical questions about operational security to philosophical discussions about the nature of human potential. By the end of their meeting, Maya had begun to understand that she was being offered something unprecedented. Membership in a community of individuals who had achieved levels of capability and consciousness that extended far beyond normal human limitations. The decision Maya faced was whether to maintain the isolation that had defined her existence since her transformation, or to risk vulnerability by connecting with others whose evolution had taken different but equally radical paths. Her core philosophy suggested that any dependence on others represented weakness, but her growing understanding of the situation at Blackwood University was challenging that assumption. Maya spent the next week analyzing her options with the same systematic approach she applied to professional contracts. The risks of joining Marcus's research community were substantial. It would require her to reveal capabilities and methods she had kept secret, to trust individuals whose true motivations she couldn't completely assess, and to accept dependencies that could limit her operational freedom. But the potential benefits were equally significant: access to resources and intelligence that far exceeded what she could develop individually, opportunities to learn from others who had achieved similar levels of transformation through different methods, and perhaps most importantly, the possibility of contributing to something larger than individual excellence, a direction for human evolution that could shape society rather than simply operating within it. Maya's decision came during her final conversation with Marcus, when he revealed the ultimate scope of what they were attempting to achieve. "We're not just studying human evolution," he told her. "We're trying to guide it. The individuals we've identified at universities around the world represent early examples of what human consciousness could become. Our research is designed to understand how those transformations occur and how they could be facilitated in others." "You're talking about deliberately creating people like us," Maya said. "We're talking about helping humanity evolve beyond current limitations. The capabilities you've developed through your own transformation could be learned and applied by others if we can understand the principles that guided your development." Maya realized that Marcus was describing a vision that would make her own evolution not an endpoint but a beginning. Rather than being a unique achievement that separated her from others, her transformation could become a model that helped others achieve similar levels of capability and consciousness. The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. Maya had built her identity around being exceptional, different from and superior to ordinary humans. The prospect of her capabilities becoming more common challenged fundamental aspects of how she understood herself and her place in the world. But as Maya considered the implications of what Marcus was proposing, she began to see possibilities that extended beyond her individual concerns. If human consciousness could indeed evolve beyond current limitations, if the kind of transformation she had undergone could be understood and facilitated in others, then perhaps the isolation and alienation that had characterized her existence weren't necessary consequences of evolution. Maya's acceptance of Marcus's invitation came not as a dramatic decision, but as a gradual recognition that her original philosophy had been incomplete. Destroying her weak self had, indeed, made her invulnerable to conventional forms of attack and manipulation, but it had also limited her ability to recognize opportunities that extended beyond individual objectives. True invulnerability, Maya began to understand, might require not just individual excellence, but the creation of communities of evolved individuals who could support and enhance each other's capabilities. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, but perhaps the community of individuals who have each destroyed their weak selves can become something greater than the sum of their individual transformations. Maya's integration into the research community at Blackwood University marked the beginning of a new phase in human evolution. Not just for herself, but for the species as a whole. The university had indeed become a gathering point for individuals who had transcended normal human limitations, and their cooperation would soon begin to influence developments that extended far beyond the boundaries of academic research. The ordinary facade that Maya had maintained as a graduate student studying biochemistry was finally abandoned, replaced by a role that allowed her to contribute her unique capabilities to objectives that were larger and more ambitious than anything she had previously contemplated. The most merciless hunter in existence had found her pack, and together they would begin hunting for nothing less than the future of human consciousness itself. In the months that followed, Maya's laboratory work took on new dimensions as she collaborated with Marcus, Professor Chen, and Dr. Vasquez to develop methods for facilitating controlled human evolution. Her expertise in biochemistry and her understanding of the physical and psychological techniques that had enabled her own transformation became resources in a project designed to guide the development of human capabilities in directions that had never been systematically explored. The federal investigation that had initially threatened to expose Maya's identity was redirected toward other targets through a combination of Dr. Vasquez's political connections, Marcus's technical capabilities, and psychological influence techniques developed by Professor Chen. But rather than simply avoiding detection, the research community began to actively influence government and academic institutions to create environments more conducive to human evolution. Maya discovered that her philosophy about destroying weakness to become invulnerable had been both correct and insufficient. Individual transformation was indeed essential for transcending human limitations, but isolated individuals, no matter how capable, could never achieve the kind of influence necessary to guide broader human development. True power required not just personal evolution, but the creation of communities that could direct social evolution. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, but the community of individuals who have each mastered this principle can do more than survive. They can become the architects of humanity's future. Maya had found her place not as a solitary predator operating from the shadows, but as a member of an evolutionary vanguard whose ultimate hunting ground was the transformation of consciousness itself. The ordinary facade of campus life continued around them, but beneath that surface, something unprecedented in human history was taking shape. The most merciless hunters in existence had gathered, and their prey was nothing less than the limitations that had defined human potential since the beginning of recorded history.